One of the lesser-known consequences of the Korean War is how quickly long-standing assumptions about survival were tested and often found wanting. Military planners in 1950 assumed that advances in logistics, equipment, and training had eliminated the improvised practices and folk wisdom that had carried soldiers through World War II. In reality, units that ignored these lessons suffered needlessly. Frostbite, exposure injuries, and preventable attrition demonstrated that surviving extreme conditions required more than manuals or standardized kits. It required understanding which strategies actually worked under pressure. If you value history that goes beyond dates and battle maps, subscribe to History Matters. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the lessons that endured because they were effective, not because they were repeated in textbooks. In this video, we're going to examine 7 widely circulated World War II survival myths that persist even today, and why believing them can still put lives at risk. The first myth is that lye or other chemical detoxes could make water safe to drink. During World War II, various chemical treatments were rumored to purify water. Soldiers were taught that adding lye or other household chemicals could neutralize bacteria or render stagnant water potable. In practice, these substances were either ineffective or highly dangerous, leading to poisoning rather than survival. In Korea, the lesson was reinforced. Water purification really needed proven chemical agents like chlorine tablets, boiling, or filtration, not improvised tricks. But even decades later, training manuals and survival courses sometimes keep repeating variations of the old lye myth, kind of neglecting the hard-earned evidence that, well, chemistry alone can't substitute for proper sanitation practices. The second myth is that heavy clothing always prevents cold injuries. Many World War II veterans recall, receiving advice to pile on layers no matter their activity level. The assumption was simple: more clothing equals more warmth. But, actually, experience proved otherwise. Excess clothing trapped sweat, leading to moisture buildup that, in turn, accelerated heat loss and increased the risk of frostbite. The Korean War's brutal winters really confirm this. Units that stuck to the more is better mindset ended up suffering higher rates of exposure injuries than those who, adjusted their layers based on how much they were exerting themselves and the environmental conditions. These days, modern cold weather training emphasizes moisture management, breathability, and ventilation, reflecting the nuanced understanding that World War II soldiers developed over those repeated winter campaigns. The third myth is that you can survive indefinitely on canned rations alone. World War II rations were designed for mobility and caloric density, but, many survival guides exaggerate their sufficiency for long-term sustenance. Soldiers quickly learned that relying solely on canned food without supplementation from local foraging or hunting led to deficiencies, fatigue, and reduced combat effectiveness. Korean War veterans who ignored this principle found that units dependent on prepackaged supplies struggled during extended operations or when supply lines were disrupted. This lesson remains relevant for modern survival planning. Diverse nutrition and resource adaptability outweigh strict adherence to issued rations. The fourth myth is that rigid bunker structures always provide superior protection. World War II shelters and bunkers were frequently portrayed as impenetrable, yet exposure injuries, water damage, and structural failures demonstrated that rigidity often backfired. Concrete bunkers trapped moisture, allowed condensation to accumulate, and limited airflow, creating unhealthy conditions for occupants. In Korea, soldiers who applied flexible shelter techniques learned from World War II survived at higher rates. Earth-covered dugouts, timber and earth bunkers, and adaptable trench shelters moderated temperature, allowed ventilation, and could be repaired incrementally. Less glamorous, perhaps, but more effective. Survival was determined by how shelters worked in practice, not on paper. The fifth myth is that panic or fear is the primary cause of survival failure. Popular accounts often dramatize panic as the enemy of survival. While fear is a factor, World War II experience demonstrated that preparation, knowledge, and environmental awareness were far more critical determinants of survival. Korean War operations confirmed this. Troops with practical, context-specific training outlasted those relying solely on psychological readiness or doctrinal memorization. The lesson endures. Knowledge and preparation, rather than fear management alone, shape outcomes in survival scenarios. The sixth myth is that camouflage is purely aesthetic and can be improvised at will. Many survival manuals emphasize that camouflage is primarily visual, yet World War II soldiers discovered that improper application could draw attention rather than conceal it. Using brightly colored or poorly applied materials often created unintended outlines or reflective surfaces. Effective concealment required understanding local terrain, vegetation, and seasonal changes. So the seventh myth is that improvisation is somehow secondary to formal equipment. There's this persistent idea in training and civilian survival courses that improvisation is just a last resort, something that's always less important than issued tools and kits. But actually, World War II experience showed quite the opposite. Life-saving improvisation often relied on everyday items, things like tins, crates, rope, cloth, and even, household junk. These were transformed into barriers, shelters, alarms, and heat retention devices. During the Korean War, soldiers who really understood this principle were able to maintain operational readiness, even when supply lines were disrupted or conditions changed unexpectedly. Improvisation, guided by experience and observation, honestly proved more reliable than over-engineered equipment alone. What these myths actually reveal is that survival is grounded in tested reality, not just doctrine. When you look across these 7 misconceptions, one theme really stands out. Survival is determined by understanding human limits, environmental dynamics, and material behavior, not by untested shortcuts or conventional wisdom. World War II veterans learned these lessons through observation, experimentation, and frankly, repeated failure, and then Korea reaffirmed them under new pressures. Yet, many survival guides still go on propagating myths that ignore these hard-earned truths, giving a false sense of security while, eroding real preparedness. The enduring lesson is that, context really does matter. Methods that worked under one set of conditions may fail if the principles behind them are misunderstood. Cold, exposure, and scarcity all obey physical laws and biological limits. Knowledge accumulated under these constraints continues to provide the most reliable guidance even decades after the conflicts that produced it. Remembering these lessons is not merely academic. They inform contemporary military planning, disaster preparedness, and civilian survival training. Understanding what truly worked and why it worked prevents the repetition of preventable mistakes and preserves the practical wisdom of those who endured the extremes of 20th century conflict. If you value historical insight grounded in evidence and experience, go ahead and subscribe to History Matters and share this video with others who appreciate serious, in-depth exploration of survival in wartime conditions. Myths can persist for decades, but history teaches what actually preserves life, and that knowledge remains indispensable today. History Vault.